down, so from 29 to 32. We're supposed to have another 4-year period from 35 to 38, and then a last 2-year period, 2040 to 2041. So that's basically a decade of running to deliver a factor 10 with respect to what we have so far. And this program is supposed to end in 2041 in order to make room for the next one. I'd like to stress that the high luminosity LHC is a gigantic project. Just to give you an impression, the annual dose at the high luminosity LHC is similar to the total dose of the LHC at the start of LS3. So everything we have done will be done in just 1 year of the high luminosity LHC. This is what an event with 140 pileup looks like. And there are huge detector upgrades that are going on right now. They're very significant. And I just want to stress the fact that we're not done. This is the next decade for Europe. Now, where will this leave us? These are the numbers from the last strategy. These are the Higgs couplings, multipliers, and this is the uncertainty that one expects. So the high luminosity LHC will leave us with couplings to the indirect coupling to the gamma, of course, via the TT loop, the W and the Z, which are better than 2%, a top coupling here, which is at the level of 3.5%, and of course, the mu1 and Z gamma as well. Z gamma getting it to 10%. A reasonable limit on the invisible Higgs decays. And the ultimate frontier, of course, the next big holy grail is the shape of the Higgs potential, which gives us information on whether this phase transition, as the universe cooled, was a first-order transition or second-order transition, is to measure these coefficients in the Higgs potential, the H cubed and H fourth, which basically translate and necessitate the observation of double Higgs production, but through this coupling and not through independent Higgs production. And right now, the old estimate spoke of getting an error on the self-coupling of the Higgs of 50% with a combination of ATLAS and CMS. By now, we know that we can do better. The improvement in analysis techniques, the understanding of the detectors, and so on, are going to improve this number significantly. Lastly, I want to make sure that we don't concentrate only on the high SPT physics. In terms of flavor physics and all the 6 CP triangles that one can draw, the one that comes in B physics is the one with rough 3 equal angles, which is 3 equal sides, which is why CP violation is large in the B sector, but it's so much harder to get. And this is today's situation. This is where we expect to be roughly next year and so on. And this is in 2035. So you can see the incredible reach and precision. That's it. Now, starting with this heritage, we have the current European strategy for particle physics. This was not always something that was going on. It actually first started in 2006. The 2013 update is the one that gave us the high luminosity LHC decision. In 2020, 7 years later, we had the first post-HL-LHC recommendations, which spoke of an electron-positron Higgs factory as the highest priority next collider, and for the longer term, a proton-proton collider at the highest available energy, spoke of the technical financial feasibility of a 100 TeV Hadron Collider, and with an electron-positron Higgs electroweak factory as a possible first stage. And finally, the community should define a global detector R&D roadmap that should be used to support proposals at the European and national levels. The 2026 update just commenced, and I will tell you more about the process in a minute, but let me first tell you that, of course, the first implementation of that is the FCC. You saw it all too well. I'm not going to show it anymore. I left this one. I thought I had killed all the slides, but it's actually indicative. If you look at all the projects, you know, this is from the last strategy, the ILC, the CEPC, the CLIC, you know, and even a notion that was born many years ago, which was a high energy LHC. The combination of the EE and HH program is the one that delivers unprecedented precision on the self-coupling of the Higgs. And the same thing holds true, of course. The blue here, the blue lines is where the combined FCC-EE and HH program are. So it yields basically unparalleled physics reach. I don't need to say more than that. The other component was the ECFA detector R&D roadmap and implementation. So in 21, we released a full roadmap and the synopsis as the Hitoshi pointed out, because people hate reading more than 10 pages. There was an overview of future facilities, but also there were 10 general strategic recommendations. And with that, they identified 9 technology domains, which are shown here, from gaseous detectors, liquid detectors, solid state detectors, and so on. And basically, there's an implementation plan that has been in place since fall of 2022. I left the slide in mainly so you can get pointers for those who are interested. Speaking of strategic R&D, there's a definition of 9 technology readiness levels from 1 to 9. So there's blue sky, which is research to prove feasibility, fundamental science, basic research. There's the intermediate stage, what we call strategic, which is technology demonstrator, and prior to that, technology development. And finally, the last 3 stages, which is experiments. So strategic R&D is a subject here, which bridges the gap between the blue sky and experiments. And this is how we then proceeded to form detector R&D collaborations to address this part here. It covers the development and maturing of technologies, iterating different options, improving radiation hardness, scaling up detector area, number of layers, etc., so that they can become viable for experiments. Now, with that, there's now a whole new structure at CERN. There's a DRD committee, Detector R&D Projects Committee, which is at the same level as the LHCC. Again, I left this here so you can have pointers to it and you can look at their meetings and so on. They're basically a reviewing body, the same way that the LHCC is for the LHC experiments. It's monitoring milestones, deliverables, and it's fully embedded in the CERN hierarchy. It reports to the research board. What about the status of the DRD collaborations? We have 4 of them: gaseous detectors, liquid, photon ID, and photon and calorimetry, which were fully approved in December of 23. We have 3 more that were just approved in June of 24, solid state, quantum, and electronics. And there's the last one, integration here, which you can think of it as detector mechanics and cooling systems and so on, for which we have a letter of intent submitted. The details of the full DRD proposals and so on can be found on CDS. I have put here all the links for those who are interested. This is just an example from the gaseous detector breakdown of the different tasks, which is improve time and spatial resolution for gaseous detectors, achieve tracking in gaseous detectors with DEDX and NDX capability, large volumes, and of course, develop environmentally friendly gaseous detectors for very large areas, achieve high sensitivity, both low and high pressure TPCs, and the list goes on. Moving on to the actual update itself. It was launched in March of 24 by CERN Council with the following timeline. There was an announcement and the call for contributions to the strategy at the end of March 2024. There are 3 bodies in the system: the Secretariat, and with its secretary, who's actually the chair in normal speak, and that's Carl Jacobs. And then there's also the CERN Scientific Policy Committee chair, that's Hugh Montgomery, the ECFA chair, Lab Directors Group chair, that's Dave Newbold. There's a physics preparatory group, which consists of the Secretariat, nominees by ECFA, SPC, 2 nominees by the Americas, 2 nominees by Asia, and 1 from CERN. And finally, the European Strategy Group, which is all of the above, plus 1 representative per CERN member state, 1 representative per laboratory in the Lab Directors Group, CERN DG, and of course, associate member states are invited to this. The deadline for submission to contributions is March 2025, a year after March 2024. There is a symposium, which is at the end of June. The site of the symposium will be decided in September, hopefully. And so that means there's a short 3 months between end of March and end of June to prepare the symposium and analyze all the contributions. We got 164 contributions last time. Then there's another short 3 months between end of June 25 and September 25 to prepare the briefing book. This is a summary, the epitome of what we learned, and finally the drafting session in 2025. And then it goes off to CERN Council, June 2026. Some differences with respect to the USP5 process, even though Hitoshi mentioned them, I'd like to reiterate them here. The USP5 process is driven by a funding agency, the DOE, indirectly also by the NSF, because they are observing and in discussions with them. But there's a single point that basically drives the whole process. The SPC is driven by CERN Council, which actually has to approve the new strategy. The big symposium to summarize and review the submissions was, or currently is, for the European strategy, driven by the DPF, the Division of Particles and Fields in the US. That's a snow mass and so on. And in this case, the European Strategy Group, the PPG, the dates are all set by CERN Council, and the symposium is driven by the Secretariat and the PPG. The closest equivalent to the DPF's reaching out to the community is basically ECFA, with its country visits and so on, country representatives. Now, a key aspect of any plan is obviously financial constraints. The USP5 process had specific funding scenarios. You saw them, the awful one and the great one and so on, the beautiful one rather. This European strategy process has no specific funding scenario as boundary condition. It's left to CERN Council after the process is converged to determine whether to proceed with a higher recommendation or not, how to fund things and so on. Another difference is that while some astroparticle physics is part of particle physics, astrophysics and gravitational waves are not, except peripherally. So in the SPP, the process is expected to converge on particle physics projects. In the USP5, the top priority was, prior to the NSF decisions, the CMB-S4. Now, the remit of the European strategy says to take into consideration various aspects of the landscape, including, very importantly, the input of the particle physics community. A major component of this overall community will be the so-called national inputs that are collected individually by each national community. Now, clearly, engaging the maximum number of colleagues, especially early career researchers, ECRs, in the field of particle physics is of the utmost importance for the process. Last time, there was a round of receiving national inputs, but we found out that the responses varied widely. For smaller countries, the feedback was uniform and easy to interpret, as you would have expected. For larger countries, the feedback was non-uniform, often favoring multiple priorities, which, when you put too many things on the list without a priority, it ends up being a no operation. And the wide range of responses made it difficult to summarize the opinion of position. And not to mention the fact that, the opinion of a country is not basically a popular vote, it's a scientific process. The lesson learned from this was that while it will always be difficult to summarize the quote-unquote position of an entire country, at least we can aim at uniform responses. And with this in mind, to be of greatest use in informing the strategy process, the information collected has to be as coherent and as uniform as possible. And thus, we have guidelines for the collection of national inputs. They are intended as suggestions, of course, for streamlining the process. They're not supposed to choke people and say that's exactly what you have to answer. I should stress that each country region is at liberty to define its own process, schedule, and questions. These national inputs to the ESPP strategy can be sent at different points in time. Prior to the deadline of 31st of March, even though that's basically mainly for, let's call it technical or physics input, But then after the March 2025 deadline, once all the submissions are in and one has the full picture, including, for example, the FCC feasibility study result, that's when the first point of most informed positions can be formed. So there's a deadline of 26th of May for that, to give us enough time to analyze it for the open symposium. And the other one is after the briefing book has been released, where again, it's a major point of information, but in time for the strategy drafting session, and therefore there's a deadline of 14 November. The guidelines suggest two, of course it's up to each country, but two town hall or similar type meetings be organized. One meeting between the end of March 25 and the open symposium, and the other one after the release of the briefing book, and with a deadline of 14 November. A central element of the next ESPP charge is the choice of next collider. It actually says explicitly our remit, our charge, the strategy update should include the preferred option for the next collider at CERN and prioritized alternative options to be pursued if the chosen preferred plan turns out not to be feasible or competitive. It is imperative that we receive explicit feedback on the preferred and alternate scenarios for this next collider, okay, because this is going to be the lab's next flagship project. And along with that, the guidelines ask for an explanation of any specific prioritization. Lastly, our charge specifies that the strategy update should also indicate areas of priority for exploration complementary to colliders and for other experiments to be considered at CERN. And therefore, it would be most useful, and this is in the guidelines, that the national inputs explicitly include preferred prioritization of non-collider projects. The guidelines are actually here. I'm obviously not going to include them in this short talk. In parallel, there's a whole bunch of meetings of early career researchers that are going on. There was a Nordic event, that's a region, not just a single country, that was organized in May. Also in May, there was an Austria event to inform early career scientists, of the physics landscape motivation, experimental overview of future collider status and physics, also of the EIC, because it's, not European, report from the panel, summary of activities in the Nordics, and then a panel discussion. This is a kind of draft thing that they put together. They had launched also a survey that collects information on collaboration sizes, career prospects, and so on. And in terms of the ESPP update, there's these events that take here, and they have a blueprint for how to organize such an event, and here is a link to it. Looking at the long-term future and the FCC, the only thing I'd like to say here, that this is a current timeline and this is where we are. In March 2025 is when the feasibility study ends, at which point we have the ESPP in earnest. 2028 is the aimed project approval by CERN Council, with the aim of starting in 2032, the construction, which can go on in parallel with the high luminosity LHC, and hopefully first operation in 2045. The rest of it all, which I have not had time to kill from my talk, has been shown by Christoph. I would like to stress that beyond this, a major part of CERN and European physics is what we call the CERN Diversity Program, and by that I mean the CERN Diversity Physics Program. And this is a list of non-highest energy collider experiments that are going on. We have experiments at the antiproton decelerator with antimatter studies, AWAKE, which is a proton-induced plasma wake field acceleration, CLOUD, which is the impact of cosmic rays eventually on climate, COMPASS and AMBER, which study now originally COMPASS hadron structure, ISOLDE or nuclear physics, Na61 SHINE for ions, neutrino targets, Na64 rare kaon decays, and the list goes on and on and on. And a newcomer into the whole game, which is we now have the ECM3 upgrade area, and that's where we have a new experiment, SHIP, which is a search for hidden particles. which will also operate on the timescale of the HLLHC. If one looks at the future of the diversity program, there's basically a lot which is there and will constitute also part of the European strategy for particle physics. So with this, my pseudo summary is that we expect the next strategy to converge on a definite, unambiguous recommendation for the next big collider at CERN, the flagship project. National inputs, including from outside Europe, will be a very important component of the process. The PPG and physics groups should be approved imminently in September, which is why I cannot show you groups and names and so on. The organizational work begins right after. Meanwhile, the work is proceeding. The FCC feasibility report is well en route to a March 25 completion, and the DRD collaborations are up and running and they're en route to their MOUs, a Memoranda of Understanding. But remember that in order to get there, we need to prove to the world that we can do this type of big project and reap big-time physics. The first major step there for the long-term future is the high luminosity LHC, which is by no means an easy or let alone trivial project. Thanks.
Very much, Paris. This was very useful, very informative, very useful. For the process is very nice. We're doing the same. Well, we're doing a planning process, strategy process in Latin America. The update and this information, which I hope you send the slides so we have all the links. This would be great. So let me open for questions from the audience or online. So I have a question. So we are in a stage similar to what you call the Open Symposium here. We already collected the white papers, and they're going to be presented in this Open Symposium. And my question is about the deadline for inputs after the symposium. Do you have any deadlines for inputs after the symposium in your strategy planning?
Yes, in fact, I clearly must have gone through it way too fast. So here we go. So they're basically, the idea is we have two major points in time. One is end of March 2025, when we know the submissions and the status of things. So that's when the first meeting is, and we have a deadline for comments by 26th of May. And then there's a second one after the release of the briefing book, not right after the symposium, but after the briefing book is out, because the briefing book is somehow the summary of eventually what evolved. We hope that the Open Symposium will have a lot of plenary session, a lot of discussion, okay? And after the briefing book is out, and therefore the community is maximally informed, this is going to come out at the end of September 2025. That would be the second time in order to meet and submit another national feedback, and the deadline is 14 November 25. Both deadlines are driven by having 2 to 2.5 weeks to the actual symposium in one case and the drafting session in the other case.
Right, so this second deadline of 14 November, so what do you expect? It's not white papers, but some input or some comments, or what is expected?
For the time being, basically, there are questions that are posed by this ECFA guidelines thing that I can actually try to pull up right here just to give you an example of things. If people have new feedback based on what has happened at the symposium and what has occurred in the what is written in the briefing book, they're free to do so. Now, this is too small for you, so let me enlarge it. So questions to be considered. This is from the guidelines, the webpage, the one that you can click on. Obviously, which is the preferred next major? And then what are the most important elements in the response? The physics potential, long-term perspective, financial, human resources, requirements, effect on other projects, timing, careers and training, sustainability. Then there's a series of questions as well related to what happens if Japan proceeds with the ILC. What happens to the plan? What happens if China proceeds with the CEPC on the announced timescale? What if the US proceeds with a muon collider? What do we do if there are major new unexpected results from the high luminosity LHC and so on? So these questions could well be informed by the briefing book, which is why there's a second chance in case it's not obligatory, if people feel that the briefing book has made the difference.
Okay, and then these are incorporated in a new version of the briefing book or not?
No.
No.
The briefing book is a briefing book. It's a summary of what transpired at the symposium. And then the drafting session is the one that creates. The briefing book is a physics input, if you want.
Yeah.
Okay? The drafting session is the one that comes up with the strategy text. The one that says,
good.
Our first priority is this one, the second priority is this. This is what we're going to do in this scenario. This is what we're going to do in the other scenario.
Okay, that's clear. Okay, thank you. So I think Hitoshi has his hand up. Hitoshi, please.
Yeah, Paris, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. The first one is about this prioritized alternative options. And that's a very difficult thing to discuss in the strategy update, I suppose, because the flagship is very likely to be FCCEE followed by FCCHH, but we don't have full understanding of how the FCCHH can be done. And also there's financial issues with FCCE as well. So how do we actually come together with this, the flagship versus prioritized alternative options in a way that wouldn't the harm the flagship option while coming up with a reasonable alternative options? Looks very difficult to me.
It is indeed. I could only agree with you that it's going to be very difficult. Which is why we're also pointing out that this is a major concern. I mean, one can always say, this is what I want to do. This is clearly, just like you had your budget constraints, but then what happens to the diversity physics program? What happens to everything else? And what's the impact on it? The other thing we have to remember is that the size of the community is not infinite. So by definition, the moment we start turning into constructing such a major new facility, it will mean that some other things will have fewer human resources and overall resources. So the question is, where do you start cutting? And presumably the final decision by council will have to look at the other priorities and start from the bottom of the list and say, this was the one thing we don't want to do, so we forget it, the second bottom, third bottom, up until they get to where it hurts. You showed us a list where it says the US will not participate in the LHCb upgrade. There's no doubt about
DOE
the LHCb. DOE, yeah, sorry, DOE, NSF might. So there's no doubt that the LHCb upgrade brings new physics and so on, but you have a budget that you have to fight with, and the DOE says, at the end of the day, this is what I'm going to leave out. There will be the same process, but this is, for a bigger room for CERN Council.
Okay. And that's my second question is actually the area or the Latin American community as a whole. So I happen to know the Japanese community is trying to put together its quote unquote national input European strategy by March. And I wonder what Latin American community would do and what kind of the prioritization process there is. I'm sure you're discussing at this meeting, but I'm curious to know what that is.
So this is going to be the outcome of this meeting, right?
I see.
So we are in the middle of the update process. If you want to take a look of what has been done 4 years ago, and there's a web page with all the physics book and the recommendations. And
that's what I have seen.
Yeah, so we're doing an update of that. So this is what we're doing.
In time for the European strategy update? Is that the plan?
Sorry?
in time for the European strategy update by March, or what is the timetable for your planning?
Yeah, so I think by March next year, we should have everything ready for the update.
Ah, that's great. Oh, okay.
Yes.
So all the roads go to Rome, Geneva.
Okay, so that's what we plan, right? Okay, so thank you very much, Paris, for the talk. And now we go on to see what is happening. Yeah, sorry. Now we go on for the strategic planning that's happening in Africa. So Kétévi, are you online? He was online. Kétévi? He was online, right?
Hello, I'm here.
Hi, Kétévi. So thanks for coming. So the next talk is by Kétévi Assamagan, and he's a professor at Brookhaven National Laboratory, and he has been involved in the strategic planning in physics in Africa, and he's going to make a presentation about that. So Kétévi, the floor is yours. I think you can share your screen.
Okay, so that's a second.
So Kétévi, I have to say that Kétévi has been a good friend of the Latin American community. So we are having common projects of students from Latin America that can go to Brookhaven to work in Atlas-related projects. But okay, go ahead, Kétévi.
All right, so first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to talk about the African strategy, which I suspect many of you may not be aware of. I see a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience. It's really a pleasure to see you again and to be here. I apologize, I would have liked to be there in person, but there are many other constraints. All right, so the African strategy for fundamental and applied physics is an effort that is driven by a bunch of folks concerned by physics advancement in Africa. Is mandated by the African Physical Society, which you may not be aware of, at least its existence and its operations. So there is a steering committee that you can reach on that email. There's a website and a Twiki and some online platforms. I am from Brookhaven National Laboratory and originally from Togo in Africa. And I'm very involved in activities in Africa, and that's one of my efforts and my concerns. So I am directly in the thick of things that are going on there in terms of physics development and so forth. All right, so we have heard about a lot of strategies, and I think folks in Europe, North America have been doing these sort of strategies for many years, and they are very advanced in those long-term plannings. European strategy, we have heard some of it here, SNOMAS as well. And recently, colleagues in Latin America developed a grassroots strategy, and an update of which is being discussed in this meeting. So all of these things are going on around the world, and the question is, what are we doing in Africa? So that's where the idea came from, that at the grassroots level, by physicists, we should start a strategy. Now, that does not mean that there are no physics strategy in Africa. There have been, and I will mention that a little bit. Then the question is the one that we are starting, or we are working on right now, which is called ASFAP, African Strategy for Fundamental and Applied Physics. What is it going to bring in addition to all the other strategies that we have in Africa? Well, our objective first is to engage African scientists in the international community in strategy development. It's a culture, it's a skill on itself to bring thousands of physicists together to discuss and agree and disagree, but eventually come up with a comprehensive document. Is really marvelous, and we would like to get that skill developed on the African continent as well. Even if not everything in the strategy is implemented, the process of actually doing it and bringing all of these learned folks and experienced folks to discuss is something to be commended. And also that sort of strategy, European and SNOMAS, the Latin American and so forth, is driven by physicists at the grassroots level. And the one that have been happening in Africa are the one that are driven by policymakers and political bodies and countries by themselves that are top down about what they are planning for the next 5 years, 10 years. Those are also strategies, but they usually don't involve the community of physicists. And at least in Africa, you don't know where they come up with that sort of strategy and who have they consulted, certainly not the large community of physicists. So we would like to complement that process by doing the grassroots strategy. And we would like the physics community in Africa to play an active role in shaping those strategic decisions by the governments, by the African governments. And also, the African Physical Society is, in our view, it needs a lot of support to become a functioning society for African physicists and so forth. And this type of strategy, we hope that it will lend support to make the African Physical Society more visible on the continent and to give it some sort of directions and for the policymakers to start paying attention. So we do have a broad footprint of discipline. It's not focused on high energy physics because most of these physics community are actually small in Africa, and it will not help to go and make a strategy of just high energy physics or high energy and astroparticle physics. We started like that, and we got a comment very quickly that all the other fields also needs to be talked about. Money is very small, communities are very small, so we need to do something comprehensive. So there is a steering committee, an advisory committee, and group conveners and subgroup conveners and so forth. And a little bit following what has been done around the world, solicitation of input from the community in terms of letters of interest, survey, panel discussion, workshop, conferences, and so forth and so forth. And progress to be discussed in these groups and subgroups and group reports and then strategy report and feedback from the International Advisory Committee and so forth, and with a final symposium. Here's how it's essentially organized. So the steering committee is the driving body around everything, and he communicates with an international advisory committee, and then they have the physics working groups, and also in addition to that, we have the engagement group that discuss important topics related to physics that impact physics, like community engagement, physics education, women in physics, young physicists forum, and so forth. And then we have an observers committee that is made of also international people who are observing what is going on and make a strategic and helpful input. And this has been endorsed by a large number of bodies, and these are some of the logos here, both in Africa and internationally. These are the endorsements, and there's the mandate coming from the African Physical Society. Yeah. Now, here's roughly the timeline. The ideas emerged in 2019, and you see that up to 2024, it's been 5 years now. We have not yet produced a comprehensive strategy report. Things have been slow along the way. We had a town hall meeting in 2021 during the pandemic. That was quite successful and draw a lot of the international community. And then we also have a community planning meeting in 2022 during the second African conference. And we are currently in 2024, and we have not yet produced the strategy report. So essentially, we should have released the report this year, but it's a little bit delayed. At least we are facing a 1 year delay at least. Yeah. So everything written here for 2024 is really been looking at for 2025. Yeah. So but we have an interim report which was released last year, and it went to the advisory committee for feedback while we were still collecting letters of interest and developing white papers and so forth. Yeah. So now in terms of the physics groups and the engagement groups, we have actually 16 physics groups. Like I said, all the physics groups have to be included. One of them is detector and instrumentation. For example, these are some of the important areas that require development. And so some of you may know most of our education in Africa is really based on theory, which is fine, but instrumentation and skilled technical skills is really lacking for various reasons. And so this is like an extremely important group. It's one of the 16 groups, and most of the groups are led by physicists from the international community, not just from Africa. And each group has a set of observers that follow the group activities. And then we have the engagement group that six societal engagements. So one of them is the Young Physicists Forum. The idea here is really to develop an association of African young physicists that is attached to the African Physics, Physical Society. Yeah, I've said we're using here young. The term is we are all young at heart. All right. So essentially, what is the motivation for all of these? I think basically that's the African physics strategy, where we have an interim report. The final report is not yet released, and hopefully it will be available next year. So you essentially know basically everything where we are. Now, I would like to go through what is the motivation for all of these and what is driving us to do this, in addition to what I mentioned, that we want to learn the process of doing strategy, which folks in Europe and North America and also Latin America know how to do very well. So we feel that there is a great hope for science in Africa. There's a lot of things going on in South Africa. We have ITEMBA Labs, which is one of the fairly advanced laboratory of accelerator physics and doing quite advanced different type of physics and not just in accelerator physics or high energy physics and so forth. And then we also have a series of accelerator-based technologies in Africa, and all the way to the SKA, the square kilometer array, most of which will be hosted in Africa. And we have many telescopes, and both in the southern and the northern part. The middle one there is one that is in Morocco. And we have some African countries and institutes involved in large-scale experiment at CERN. Morocco and South Africa are in Atlas. Egypt is in CMS, in addition to Nigeria and Tunisia, who have recently joined. Madagascar is the one African country in the DUNE collaboration. And then recently, 7 African countries are getting organized to join the Electron Ion Collider, which will be at BNL. So there is a lot of things going on, either regionally or individually by different countries, and some of them at the international scale. In addition to that, since our strategy is not just particle physics and astrophysics, we have to talk about material physics, light sources as well in the African strategy. There is a huge effort in material physics and material characterization that require X-rays and light sources, an effort in developing African light source is going on. And there are some facilities that have been already constructed. In Benin, the X-Tech lab is going to be an X-ray facility source. The African light source is a vision, it's a project going on right now. I mentioned the SKA radio telescopes, most of which that will be hosted in Africa with 10% in Australia. Then there is also a lot of effort on renewable energies in Africa. You see the world's biggest solar plant in Morocco there. So many things are going on, and how do you pull these things together into a comprehensive vision, given the fact that everything is, in the end, is money, and money is tight. And there are people who always tell you there are basics of problems and, hunger and diseases and so forth, and where do you put priorities with respect to fundamental research? Now, Africa is a home of 15% of the world's people, and its contribution to the world research is really not great. But we have a lot of young people in Africa. You can see the chart over there that a lot of African people are under 25 years old. So the human potential is just amazing, and those people need good education. And if we want to really make fundamental changes in Africa. So how do you actually tap into that human capacity, that human potential? And at some point in the future, half of the people are going to be born in Africa. So it's really, I don't know, it's a lot of people, but resources are not that great. So the question is, how do you change that philosophy? Now, so I mentioned a lot of strategies that are top-down. There is the African Union, which is really a political body trying to get African countries together to have a coherent vision for their own problems and for their own future. And they have a lot of strategies. They have strategy for African space strategy, and they have the continental strategy for technical, vocational, and educational training. And they have science, technology, and innovation strategy. They have continental educational strategy for Africa. All those things have very well-developed documents and well-written at the top level. For example, me and a lot of our colleagues don't know who are the experts who developed the science, technology, and innovation strategy, because they were the consultants of certainly good people, but the broader community of physicists that could have been involved were certainly not involved. And that's the reason why we want to do the African strategy for fundamental and applied physics, driven at the grassroots level by us, the physicists, so that we can have a direct input into the vision that is being developed for the continent. Now, for all of these strategies developed at the African Union level, or even African governments, or even regional level, the issue has been implementation. So beautiful documents have been developed and people work hard, but then they sit somewhere and they are collecting dust because nobody knows how to implement them because there's no money. So that's really, every time you want to do a strategy in Africa, everybody will tell you, you need to worry about the implementation as well. You don't just do a strategy and then, another body of people develop actionable plans for them, an institution to to think about implementing all or some of them. You have to always also think about the implementation from the start, because otherwise the document is going to bog down. So I mentioned International Advisory Committee. Yes, a list of the people who are serving in this committee right now. We have Professor Fernando Quevedo, who was former director of ICTP, a great supporter of our events, and has always been behind everything that we are doing, and we are grateful to have him. Yeah, this steering committee members, and then the charge for the observers committee. There's a number of international folks who are serving as observers. The working group, I mentioned them. They are responsible of collecting LOI, developing surveys, workshop, panel discussion, conference, and so forth. And there is a process of submitting letters of interest, which is still open. And then there is also the groups are divided into different subgroups, and there is a registration process for people to participate, which is still open, and to offer constructive opinion and stuff like that. And we have tried to encourage a lot of people across the continent and beyond to get involved, and also to organize themselves into the white paper study group. And they has another issue that we have had in Africa, is that people don't just want to come voluntarily and work for this thing. They want to know what are they going to get. If they do work toward this strategy, is this work going to be published in a scientific journal? Are they going to get credit for their participation? Those are big issues in Africa. Otherwise, people are not motivated to do the work. You really have a serious problem. Yeah, and so those are things, because their institution don't have a formal way of supporting them for participating, and they need to know what they're going to get. Yeah. So having that discussion, or talking to people about the usefulness of a strategy, and what is not only the collective impact in developing or working together to develop this type of document, but the individual contribution. What does the individual receive or is going to gain out of it? It's extremely important, at least on our continent, before people are motivated to do the work. That's a part of the things that are making progress very slow, because we also don't have money to promise anything to the participants, and we cannot also promise that their work is necessarily going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal that they can then quote to their institution. And we don't have money to support their participation in meetings and conferences and stuff like that. So then people are less motivated to contribute. So those are our big challenges. Yeah. So a final report is in progress. There is a draft which is currently in preparation after we have developed the interim report. All the working group are expected to contribute to it, but there are some working groups that are making more progress than others. Some working groups are much larger than other working groups, and so forth. At the conclusion of the draft report, we will organize a symposium to present the report to the international community. I showed you the timeline, but I said that it's delayed by a year. We expect the symposium to be held in 2025, September or October, most likely. That is still being discussed currently. After the symposium, then we'll collect the final round of feedback based on what is presented at the symposium. It's not clear yet where we will host the symposium. In fact, there's a discussion now. It should be held somewhere in Africa, but we don't really have money to support travel for even all of the conveners, and UNESCO is stepping in to try to take some of the charge, in which case that symposium might be held at the ICTP in Trieste. So all of those things are still being worked out and so forth. Now, as implementation, I mentioned that in our case, we have to think about it as well. How is this document going to be implemented so that it doesn't sit somewhere and collecting dust? So that does require community buy-in. So we are making a lot of effort first to have the community of physicists buy in, which means that they just don't endorse the work, but they actually get involved, because if the document is not comprehensively actually worked on by a lot of people, then you have folks who don't agree with what is written there, or their research direction is different from that, and they don't see it in there, therefore they don't endorse it, and then things don't go very well. Now, so in addition to community buy-in, you also need the financial resources, which in Africa, you have to take into account also other priorities. And so it's not clear how governments will allocate, the resources. So now we know that in Europe, North America, and certainly in Latin America, strategies is repeated periodically every 7 to 10 years. You review implementation, what was implemented in the previous strategy, what was not, and why not. You update, and it's a new development nationally, regionally, priorities have changed. You integrate lessons learned from the previous strategies, and you bring in more grassroots and international bodies. Those things are very well, done. And when not the entire strategy or its recommendation are not all implemented, nobody feels bad about it, so it just gets updated. So those are all cultural views that are not yet taking root in Africa, because people can get discouraged that we did this work last time, even half of it was not implemented. Why do you want to do it again 7 years later? That's exactly the question we are getting, even from large body like the African Union. They have done something, there's no money to implement it. They don't see the reason why we should be doing the African strategy at the grassroots level, and we should be worrying about how to find money to implement what they have already written, which of course, is one view. But you see the dynamics of why things are getting delayed for us. First, the cultural understanding of really just coming together and doing a strategy, even if not all of it is implemented, just developing that culture is delayed for us, because even the individual physicist wants to know what he or she is going to get if he spends some time working on this strategy. Is he getting, or is she getting a paper? Is she getting support to go to conferences? That needs to be concrete. Otherwise, you have a lot of problem motivating people. Yeah, and then how does this fit into regional or national strategies and so forth? And what happens if not everything gets implemented? All right, so that's a flavor of what we are facing in Africa, and brings me to my conclusions. We have many roadmaps and strategies already developed in Africa, so it's not something new. Our governments have, 5-year plan, 10-year plans already, which they do regularly, and at the UN, African Union, they also have strategies. I showed you some of them. But these strategies, they often like broader community consultation and inputs, and it's basically top-down, and it's a government or dictated strategy, and nobody knows who they have consulted. And in many cases, they face problem of implementation, and they are essentially, whatever is written is essentially dormant. Now, with the African strategy for fundamental and applied physics, we propose to develop a strategy mandated by the African Physical Society, with a broad community consultation driven at grassroots level by physicists, broad footprint of all the physics and engagement topics that are important to Africa, and bringing the African community together to learn the process of coming together, developing a strategy, even if not everybody agrees on what are the priorities and what should be the major direction, at least learn how to do it and pass it on to the younger generation and repeating it periodically like it's done elsewhere. So after a few years of work, so since 2019, we are talking about essentially 5 years now, a strategy report is under development. It's actually quite fairly advanced, but it still needs some work, and it's expected to be completed in 2025 and be presented in the international to the international community and policymakers, and then moving into the implementation phase, which I didn't develop. The idea is that once that report is completed, a new committee, a new body will be formed to actually work toward the implementation in lobbying our governments and the African Union and international bodies and so forth. So ultimately, for the future, we must encourage greater participation. So right now, participation has been low for the problem that I mentioned. People want to know what are they going to get if they participate in this effort, and how are they going to be rewarded as individual participants or individual physicists. And integrating the lesson learned in this inaugural strategy and reviewing what was implemented or was not, and not get discouraged that not all of the recommendations are implemented, and the understanding that not all of them might not be able to be implemented because of money is tight. It still needs to sink into our psyche in Africa so that we can keep coming together and still be motivated and doing it again, even if the previous one is not fully implemented. And adapt to changing priorities for the African community so that we can better serve the community. Therefore, we need to stay engaged to know what are the problematics and what should be how do we correct our direction from strategy to strategy so that it better serve our communities. So that's where we are, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Kétévi. It's good to know all these activities that's going on in Africa, and we do face similar challenges here, so we can discuss this later. So are there questions for Kétévi? Yes, Bruno.
Thank you very much for this beautiful overview.
We have to speak louder.
I have a question about the role of so the ICTP in Rwanda. Similarly, in Sao Paulo, there's a center there. Of course, it's a series center. I could imagine that was being great meetings to train, because the manpower is a problem like Latin America. Is there any input from them, or do you work with them?
So I'm not sure if can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, ICTP. Yes, in Rwanda. Yeah. We are aware of them, and some of the past leaders are also members of the African Physical Society. Yes, actually, we worked with that center in 2016 before it was inaugurated to hold the African School of Physics there. They have now, I think they now have extended beyond material physics into also astrophysics and particle physics. So they are very well engaged, and most of the physicists there and some of us have lectured there, and we do activities with them. So it's we will certainly appreciate to have more centers like that in Africa. And many of our students who have gone through our school, either through AIMS or the African School of Physics, they continue their education at the ICTP Center in Rwanda, and sometimes they go to the ICTP in Trieste. And ICTP itself has been a strong supporter for our activities, and some of the finances we are getting from this for these strategies are coming from the ICTP. So it's all well connected. And I mentioned the case of Fernando Quevedo, who has really be instrumental behind all of our efforts and connecting us to the right bodies and encouraging us to apply for funding here and there and so forth. Yeah, so they are a part of what we are doing. Yeah.
Okay. And any further questions for Kétévi? People online? Audience? Okay, if not, let's thank Kétévi again for this nice job. And last but not least, we'll hear from Marta Losada about the first strategic planning in Latin America. She was the driving force behind it, and she's going to review what was done, what we have accomplished. So Marta, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be able to have this presentation today, following all of these other strategic planning efforts that are being done in different regions of the world. So I want to start with a little bit of the history of how this Latin American strategy came about and some of the outcomes of the process. And so here's the timeline that I want to focus on. Starting in, whoops, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen and your mouse.
Okay, good. So starting with the brainstorming that occurred precisely at ICTP-SAIFR's 5th anniversary, and then a follow-up of discussions that were held in Guatemala, actually, when the SILAFAE was held there in 2016. Starting from that, we made an initial request to obtain 2-page briefs of around 18 experiments that we knew of that were being developed in the region. And that allowed us to put together the fundamental presentation that we were able to then take to a ministerial meeting of science and technology at the Ibero-American level that also occurred in Guatemala, and obtain a first mandate to develop this strategic process. Because unlike Africa, we don't have the similar Africa to the Africa Physics organization and so on and so forth. So there wasn't like a clear body for the mandate. Then in November 2018, we had the first town hall meeting in the SILAFAE in Peru to discuss the mandate and what would be the next steps. And I want to highlight really the relevance, the importance of having the national meetings and the formation of the preparatory with delegates at the time of 10 different Latin American countries. And this happened in the early months of 2019. And then in May of 2019, we were able to hold the first LASF4RI workshop and meeting of the preparatory group again at ICTP-SAIFR in Sao Paulo. And in the following months, the high-level strategy group was defined, its composition with stakeholders from the region and international members as well. We defined the submission of the white papers for this strategic process to end by December of that year of 2019. And then in January 2020, we had the kickoff meeting of the high-level strategy meeting. In July 2020, we had the open virtual symposium for the first time, in which all of the white papers were presented. And then we started in the process of delivering the physics briefing book and the strategy document. The high-level strategy group then endorsed the strategy document that had been produced. And after receiving that endorsement in October 2020, we also were able to present the strategy once again to the ministerial meeting at the Ibero-American level. And then next steps for the preparatory group and national processes would starting in December 2020 for the next cycle. So here we have what was the outcome of this process, a first time strategic planning process in HECAP with community input done in the whole Latin America. And we had a two-prong approach. And this was on one hand to really get the buy-in also at the ministerial level of how to promote the establishment of a Latin American strategy for research infrastructures in general, but to spearhead the process for a specific field of knowledge. And we started, of course, with our field of high energy astroparticle physics and cosmology. Main goals of the process were to be able to chart what was the landscape of the existing infrastructure and expertise that has already been developed in the region, to be able to build a consensus and support for a strategy-based approach for the participation in and development of large-scale research infrastructure projects in Latin America, to be able to really reach out to the community and agree on establishing a strategic scientific forum to coordinate these Latin American activities, and very importantly, to set up the first Latin American scientific roadmap for HECAP in particular, and what to really define and make very visible the inherent need for the long-term planning and funding implementation after an open call for input from the scientific communities. And in this way, to enable a more effective development of the Latin American research groups, facilitating multilateral participation in regional and global research infrastructures, increasing their impact. And the goal at the time was then to inform the ministerial meeting. So as I said, this actually was a very clear goal, and we were able to go successfully through the whole process. Here's a list of the different preparatory group members from the different countries. And also we had participants representing, if you want, different regions of the world, and from Europe, US, and Asia. And at the time, we also had some observers that gradually also became formally incorporated into the preparatory group, particularly from Central America. Very importantly, the high-level strategy group members, and the chair was Luciano Maiani, and he still is the chair, and Fernando Quevedo, the co-chair. Fernando Quevedo also, as Kétévi has mentioned him several times, has been instrumental in facilitating many of these processes. And I want to say he sends his greetings to all of you now. He's here in Abu Dhabi with me. We had the country regional scientific representatives for the high-level strategy group. They're listed on this slide as well. Really very important contributions from all of them. And very importantly, also the main labs that are located in the region. We had the directors involved in the high-level strategy group. One very crucial thing was for us to start an initiative that would start to incorporate also representatives of funding agencies or research councils into our processes. And in the first initiatives, these were the delegates that were sent from the different funding agencies. And now, as you've seen in the first day of this symposium for the update of the strategic process, we had actually presentations from the funding agencies, and very importantly, they were highlighting some of the key projects that were identified in the landscape of the first strategic process. So as a result of this strategic planning, we identified this landscape with around an estimate of 1,000 researchers in the field of HECAP in the region. We produced the physics briefing book, and it has a lot of different details, but it's very nicely summarized in this graph, which really shows for the different fields that we're interested in, the different projects that countries are involved in. And of course, we have a lot of inhomogeneity within the countries that we are in the region, much larger ones, much smaller ones. And so there are, different intensities and development stages of development. But this is really a nice illustration of all of the really diverse and rich activity that's going on in the region in HECAP. And the color code here for the different projects are really the darker ones are those that were active projects. The next slide is kind of a tone, shows those that were coming online pretty soon. And then the lighter ones were the ones that are more further into the future. So this really is what we want to obtain as a result of this update of this strategic process, is what does this kind of a graph now look like, 5 years later. And one of the key things that was gained from this process was to really enhance the visibility of what type of particle physics, astrophysics, and cosmology was being done in the region. And here, this is a diagram that was produced from, extracted from Symmetry magazine, that really took into account the results of our physics briefing book. And I really want to reiterate that I think that one of the biggest outcomes was enhancing the visibility of the community in Latin America. So then, of course, there was also the strategic document that was prepared in addition to the physics briefing book, with committee members that actually wrote that document. And it had very specific recommendations, and I'll go through them rather quickly. The first recommendation is to support the development and operation of current and next generation projects in astronomy, cosmology, and astroparticle physics located in Latin America, enhancing leadership roles in these strategic regional projects that drive capacity building and technological development. And so in each one of these slides, at the bottom of the slide, you see which were the ongoing experiments, which were the short-term experiments that should come online, midterm, and the longer term. And again, one of the outcomes of what this new update process is going to tell us what has changed, what has been effective, what has actually been realized of this landscape of projects in the region. And of course, there were many other outcomes that were expected from this recommendation, and they're listed here. And because of time, I won't go through them in too much detail, but it's clear that the effort was done to really identify for each one of the recommendations what would be the significance for the region to develop them. The second recommendation was to pursue the establishment of the flagship international laboratory Andes that would enable the region as a global center for underground physics and other sciences. The third recommendation was to support the existing efforts in international projects in which Latin American groups are actively participating and in some cases leading initiatives as a strategy to position Latin America to key leadership roles in future international flagship projects in collider and neutrino physics. So again, here we have separately for colliders and for neutrino experiments, the different activities that the community has been involved with, and will be very interesting to see what is the update. And as was discussed due to Hitoshi's question to Rogerio, how we will produce some input for the European strategy by March of 2025. The fourth recommendation, to support small-scale, high-impact, dedicated experiments across HECAP. There is really this need of striking this balance and being able to develop new ideas, and it had been actually very evident in this process that we did before, that there was a lot of development of new technologies in the region, and these should continue to be strengthened. So here is a table that gives us the roadmap of the current and future experiments that were identified in that first strategic planning process. And really, as I want to reiterate, we're looking forward very much to the update of this roadmap from this update process. Then, in addition to that, there were recommendations for a healthy and integral HECAP science program in LA. And the fifth recommendation was to strengthen the collaboration among different theoretical groups in the region working in the field and their interactions with the experimental efforts. The sixth recommendation, to support and develop advanced training programs that harness regional capacities and expertise across all Latin American countries that are active in HECAP. There's been, I would say, a wonderful dynamic and evident growth even since the first strategic process that has been done, but it does not mean that we're still at the target, I would say, of what we want to have in progress in terms of advanced training programs. The seventh recommendation, to foster R&D capabilities in key technologies across HECAP, enabling connections with industry and with possible broader societal impact, is a key aspect that I think was reiterated also yesterday in the presentations and discussions with the funding agencies. Recommendation 8, enhance the high-performance computing infrastructure and internet connectivity in the region. This, of course, is crucial for us in so many of these experiments that we want to develop. And the 9th recommendation, to develop formal and stable mechanisms for coordination and funding among research councils and funding agencies at the regional level to support HECAP initiatives. And I think that this is really one of the efforts that still needs a big push from all of us to find what is the best way to define these kind of mechanisms. And finally, the 10th recommendation, to encourage the dissemination of knowledge, outreach, and the active involvement of the general population in scientific research, boosting societal engagement. So as a summary, we had 4 major recommendations with respect to research infrastructures, ensuring a rich program of astroparticle, and cosmo experiments within the region with enhanced participation of Latin America on a larger than 10-year scale, the development of new facilities and areas of expertise within the region associated to these areas that are listed there on the slide, to continue the strong links and participation in major international projects in collider and neutrino physics by a more focused, coordinated, and impactful approach. I mean, we heard a little bit about what has happened since this strategy was done, in particular in the major contributions that are being done to the Dune experiment, and the Fermi Labs director was presenting on this yesterday, that are being done by groups from Latin America, and Brazil is doing a large part, but it's not only Brazil, there are other countries that are involved as well, to maintain a balanced approach, including the small-scale regional projects to drive new ideas and technological developments. And then, of course, the 5 recommendations to strengthen the HECAP science program as a whole. And the final recommendation is the one that I mentioned before, which is, I think, the biggest pending issue, on the stability and continuity mechanisms in funding. So then we had the strong endorsement by the high-level strategy group in the meeting of October 20 of 2020, and they recognized the degree of maturity of the region in this field, and the development of the leadership roles in state-of-the-art large research infrastructure and related experimental facilities. And they clearly were in agreement that these 10 overarching recommendations, if they had a successful implementation, could lead to a significant improvement for the region in terms of the scientific development. And they recognize also the major recommendations. I won't go into this just because of the lack of time, but clearly was very clear alignment with the 4 major scientific recommendations. But in addition to that, they made some other suggestions. Really strongly recommended that the HECAP community put in place a robust structure and mechanisms that would allow the community to come together on a periodic basis, ideally about every 5 years, to examine progress and consolidate community input to develop and or update the strategic plan for the region. And so this is what is being done currently. And then, as I mentioned before, this was presented to the Ministerial Meeting of Science and Technology, and this was really very well received by this group, and acknowledging this effort of establishing this strategic planning process for the Latin American region. I will have to say also that many different scientists from the region were able to also present the results of this strategic process at several conferences and venues like CILAC, the APS, the African Strategy Conference, SNOMAS, LAFI, the Spring Meeting, and other regional meetings, again, enhancing the visibility of all of the activity that is being done in HECAP within Latin America. There have been other results that are important, as allowed for more coordination and organization within the region to define representatives to different international groups. We have, of course, as I mentioned before, new members also in the preparatory group. from Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala. There's now a new chair and co-chair of the preparatory group, Rogerio and Diana Lopez Nasir from Argentina, and other nominations. Very importantly, also the mobility programs that were developed with ICTP, Trieste Network Program, and a new CLAF agreement, and also possibly a contribution to this visibility of the region is that now we'll be having the first ICHEP organized in Latin America for the very first time, and Rogerio with Ignacio Bediaga have taken on this huge challenge. So the timeline continued. We had the new preparatory group meeting in 21-23 with a mandate, sorry, for 21 to 23. And then there was the November 2021 SILAFI meeting that was set up, and there the creation of the Latin American Association for HECAP was performed with specific bylaws. And then in the following year, November 2022, we had the first LAA HECAP General Assembly. So this is a very important outcome of this process to establish this Latin American Association for HECAP, and it has very specific goals that are listed here. Again, one of the goals I want to continue to highlight is to be able to engage with ministries and funding agencies to promote the rollout and development of these strategic planning processes. There's a website for the Latin American Association for HECAP. There are 562 members currently. The chair is Rogerio, the vice chair is Fernando Quevedo. There's an executive committee, but there are also other specialized committees on EDI, communication, etc., that have grown out of this LAA HECAP organization. Our current timeline then is the announcement of the update strategy process was done in November of 2023. The deadline for white paper submissions was July of this year. We are currently at the symposium where we're discussing all of these submissions and seeing also what has gone on in the rest of the world and since the first strategy. And then the expectation is that the new strategy and roadmap documents will be finalized by 2025. So to conclude, I say that it was a very successful first process to produce the landscape and roadmap for HECAP in the Latin American region. The launch of a second bottom-up strategic process with a good representation of the fields of activity in countries of the region, given the submissions of the new white papers. I think it's very important to stress that strengthening the national strategic processes is a crucial element that should be done, and that if we are really very successful, if we are to have a continuation of this regional process on the timescale of every 5 years. I want to thank Rogerio, Fernando, Luciano, and all members of the preparatory group and high-level strategy group for the commitment and very hard work. And I also want to say that I'm looking forward to the results of this new process. Thank you very much.
Questions for Marta? Yeah. Arinaldo?
I just want to congratulate you all by good work.
Questions online for Marta? No.
So I actually do have one, which is perhaps not just to Marta, but to all of you, is that one of the points you mentioned that was a meeting with the ministerial meeting. And it was, well, what exactly is this?
So this is the Ibero-American ministerial meeting of ministers of science and technology from countries of Ibero-Americans. They meet regularly to discuss matters of science and technology, and they every meeting they have what they call it,
A declaration.
some declaration. And now what they did is that there was a mandate from this interministerial meeting or organization for a LASF4RI to happen, to this planning to take place. And then after this is done, we sent them the report, and they said, "Oh, this was very good work, etc., etc." So it's written there in their declaration. I don't know if that was your question.
Yeah, I just want to know if whatever the results of this meeting is ever transferred to the funding agencies.
Yes, yes, precisely. This is the point. There are different ways of doing this. One of them is to ensure that the different community members that are taking active part in this process do that exercise, you know, taking back the briefing book, taking back the strategic document to each one of their funding agencies. But we've also convened them, and Rogerio and I, Fernando, we've had also meetings with different representatives of the different funding agencies, and we could try to reiterate these results. We met with the Minister for Science of Brazil at one point, and so on and so forth. So yes, there are different ways in which we actually do this, but the important thing is really to show a very solid process that arrives at consensus, that is able to achieve this type of validation by the international community as well, and that visibilizes a lot the work that's being done in the region.
Yes, Edgar.
I guess I'm curious. I suppose you guys invited most of the funding agencies, and I know what happened with mine, as I was telling you. But okay, that was probably expected. But I'm really surprised for instance, Colombian funding agency, which is much bigger and from my perspective, much well-structured, much better structured than ours. And so, and since they are not here or not participating, did we get some feedback? I mean, I'm curious to know about that.
I didn't get any feedback. I didn't get an answer. So we sent invitations to all of them, of course. Most
So
of them.
yeah, but let me again reiterate, we have asked, of course, the community members in each one of the countries to do this task of really engaging with the funding agencies. The particular case in Colombia, and this time there was no response, but they have participated in some of the other events that we developed. You remember, Rogerio, even at Sao Paulo. So maybe it's just one off situation, but in addition, again, I think that this is why it's so important to have the members of the preparatory group that can go back to each one of their funding agencies.
Yeah. Also Peru. No, Peru participated in the first. Okay. So this is our job. To get in touch and try to get them to participate. But I was happy with the outcome, even though we didn't have all of them, but we have many participations. So I was happy with the outcome. Chile participated, that was nice. Okay, any further questions for Marta? So thank you very much, Marta.
Thank you.
Now we go for lunch. Marta, go to sleep.